Dr. Jonny Bowden, what's going on, man?
I'm so glad to see you as always.
Dude,
As
I on you and I brag on you all the time. I'm like, of all the people that I've met in the kind of low carb space in the early days, it was cool meeting Eric Westman. It was cool meeting Jeff Folick and Steve Finney, and I could go down the line and insult a lot of my friends from the early days. But it was Dr. Jonny Bowden that first kind of reached out to me. And I've told you this story many times before, Jonny, where he's the author, you guys. He is, by the way, Dr. Jonny Bowden. Jonny Bowden over on Instagram, JONNYBOWDEN. Go check him out.
you.
Uh,
You're the greatest.
you were like the first person that was famous that reached out to No Name Jimmy Moore and said, hey, I love what you're doing with Living La Vida Low Carb. Here's an autographed copy of my book, Living the Low Carb Life was what it was called then. It's called Living Low Carb now. And I was just like, whoa, I have a published author that sent me a book. Of course, I was kind of new to all of it. And little did I know, here we are 15 years later, I'm an international best-selling author, just like you. And we're out here doing
Bigger even. You have an empire, bigger even than I was. Very,
but
very.
you've been out there a long time. You are a prolific writer. You have a brand new edition of a book you wrote about 8 years ago with Dr. Stephen Sinatra called The Great Cholesterol Myth.
Yes.
It was literally like a year before my book came out, Cholesterol Clarity. But you guys have so much information, and we're definitely going to put, I'm sorry, what?
Which was a great book. I just want to add that little editorial comment. I always recommend my book because I think it's but I tell people you need to hear this information from someone. If you don't like me, go to Jimmy Moore, go to, the other people who, Anthony Coppola, I don't care, but people need to hear the message that's in there. And yours is a wonderful book.
Thank you. And so cholesterol is one of those weird subjects, Jonny. Like I remember when I went on the Atkins diet, lost the weight, went to see my doctor, and he's like, whoa, you lost a lot of weight. But then like the next question out of his mouth when I said, how'd you do it? He's like, oh, what's your cholesterol? And I'm going, why is that the default? And we're still in the era where people think cholesterol means something. And I know you and I've had many discussions about this over the years. And it's fortunate that this is something that, despite your great tome on the subject, mine, Malcolm Kendrick, Anthony Coppola, all of us have written about it for many years, it's still just a source of confusion. And I want to ask you just bluntly, why do you think people still worry about it? Is it because they're trusting in the doctors still, and the doctors make a big deal about it?
Jimmy, I know you and I both read very much outside of our fields into politics and psychology, and the answer to this really isn't a nutritional answer. It's an answer about how difficult it is to get people to change their minds. And Upton Sinclair has a wonderful quote saying it's almost impossible to get a man to change his mind when his salary depends on not changing his mind. We're talking about a $31 billion business, lowering cholesterol. And as I'm sure we're going to get into in our discussion, there are now tests that are actually useful to measure important parts of the cholesterol metabolism, and we don't use them. And every survey I've looked at, or even informal surveys of doctors, like, why are you still using the equivalent of an Atari 64 computer when we've got, what we've got? And they go, it's good enough. It's too big a deal to change. All the insurance codes are coded for it. It works. It's almost as good as the others. We don't want to learn a new system. I mean, that's basically what it is. And Dr. Oz asked me when we first did the Great Cholesterol Myth, why do people continue to believe this? And I said, Dr. Oz, at one point, the greatest scientists in the world thought the earth was flat. I don't know why. At some point, they'll slap their collective palm to their head and go, what were we thinking? But right now, it is very, very difficult to change those wheels. So many things, the drug companies, the journals, they are all, it would affect everything if we used a different standard. And so we've got this one. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't tell us very much, but it's our crappy test, so we're going to stick to it. That's kind of the attitude.
The problem is it's familiar to the consumer as well as the practitioner.
Yes.
It's something that does change when you do things in your lifestyle and do things with medications the change doesn't mean anything, but that's irrelevant because you see change. Therefore, if there's change happening, something good must be happening. And so that's where the ruse comes in. People think lowering cholesterol is doing something, a step in the right direction with their health. And I lower your cholesterol very, very well right now, having you guzzle vegetable oils. You can lower it like a champ. You can lower your cholesterol levels. Are you making yourself healthier? Not by a long shot.
Well, that is the question.
That would lower cholesterol, but it's not making you healthier. So instead of numbers-based treatment, we should be looking at outcomes-based treatment, which is a totality, not just of cholesterol numbers and not just the relevant ones, which you have identified in the updated version of your book, but also things like inflammation markers, IGF-1, HSCRP, homocysteine. None of those ever come into the context of looking at the cholesterol. And what about insulin and fasting blood sugar and all the things that we talk about in kind of the low carb world? All of these things should be looked at as a totality and not just a standard lipid panel, which is incredibly useless.
I could not agree more. You know, there's so many things to unpack in the cholesterol myth, and it's not one myth, it's a series of myths. But you go back to the thing that you mentioned earlier about how people are so conditioned to equate cholesterol with heart health. And if you went into any cocktail party in the olden days when we had cocktail parties and people would say, how's your heart? I mean, the answer would always be, well, my doctor says my cholesterol is fine. That's the marker. And it is embedded in our subconscious, just like fear of fat. It is, in the olden days when we traveled, I would go around, do lots of morning television shows. Up till January, I was doing them all the time. I still do them from my kitchen. But the audiences consistently still have to be taught that eating fat doesn't make you fat, and eating fat doesn't give you heart disease. And it is just, it's like the fact checkers in somebody goes out and says something outrageous and the fact checkers come, but nobody's listening to the fact checkers. They're listening to the outrageous performance that was made. And this is, I'm not talking about anybody in particular. I'm saying in general, the actual fact checkers get the least amount of print and the people who make the proclamations get the most. And the proclamations you and I have been hearing since 1986 is fat causes you to be fat. Fat raises your cholesterol, and cholesterol causes your heart disease. Therefore, we should eliminate fat and cholesterol from our diet. And that has been the basic dietary mantra from 1986 on. And as you've seen, it has not worked very well.
Well, and Jonny, you've been at this a whole lot longer than me. I've been at it 15 years, and we were talking right before we came on the air. You were around and established long before I came around. And so you've kind of seen all the trends. Would you agree with me? I've at least seen it in my career that in just the past 15 years, we've seen a dramatic shift. Like when Dr. Atkins died, very tragic. Before I even went on the Atkins diet, he already had his slip and fall accident. He was gone, and it was just dead there for a few years. I came along, others came along, and we kind of picked up the torch and ran with it. But then it was so taboo to even think about healthy fats, at least now in the mainstream culture. Thanks to keto becoming popular, thanks to paleo, thanks to kind of Whole30, all the everything, it's become a little less taboo to talk about healthy fats. And so we're starting to look at, well, avocado and avocado oil and olive oil. They're still a little bit fearful of butter, but they're almost like, well, margarine ain't that great and butter ain't that great. So they're kind of like leaving people to their own devices. But it's way better than it was when you and I were kind of in the drudges of this 15 years ago.
I would agree with most of that. I would say it's somewhat better. And the reason I say somewhat better is because I encounter, I'm sure you do too, on a daily basis, people whose doctors are telling them the same crap that they told them when I started as a personal trainer at Equinox Fitness Clubs in 1990, 30 years ago. And I'm still hearing when I tell people to eat more of whatever I tell them to eat, or they come back time and time again and said, my doctor says this is bad. My doctor says this about my cholesterol. This is what my cholesterol test is. They're getting prescriptions based on the old HDL, LDL test, which, by the way, people, if you take nothing away from this interview, one of the main messages of our book is that test should be retired forever. And if your doctor ever gives you a prescription, I get exercised about this because it is so obvious and so clear from the research and from everything we talked about in the book. If your doctor gives you a prescription that is based on the old-fashioned test, it's like giving you a prescription based on Cosmopolitan's astrology predictions for this month. It is a useless test for determining whether or not you should be on a drug. And interestingly enough, people hear me say that and they think I'm so anti-statin. But in fact, when you use the correct test, you find out, yes, statins are being overprescribed for a huge number of people. For some people, they're being underprescribed because that stupid test does not catch what we need it to catch.
So you identified a population that I think is the problem, and that's the medical professional being trained in the medical mainstream setting. That medical school training and trying to teach them more of lipid metabolism, of glucose metabolism, and the whole endocrine system. They're not learning that enough to know that cholesterol is meaningless. I'm talking about, though, with the general population. Yes, a lot of them are getting educated, going to see their doctors, but we do have this thing called the internet, and we do have this thing where people do a DuckDuckGo search, a Google search, and they're finding people like you and me, and they're hearing this information. And I think from 15 years ago, when we didn't have iPhones yet, like this didn't even exist when I first started doing this work, and you were out there back when like dial phones were. I'm just kidding.
Are you trying to say something that I'm very old?
Because the technology has brought us closer to the people that would follow us. That's, I guess, what I was talking about, that the common consumer at least has at their fingertips podcasts like this one, people like you and me writing all kinds of books about all kinds of subjects, trying to learn and educate the public.
Let me say two things about a couple of the points you just made, just for clarification to people who may not know our work as well as we do. You said cholesterol doesn't count. I want to slightly pull that into focus. We do think that cholesterol plays a role in heart disease, but you have to understand that when they came up with the concept that we can measure cholesterol in the blood, you used to have one number, and you'd go to a health fair. In time before you were born, you go to a health fair and there'd be these people and they take a little pinprick. This was a new concept. And, oh, Mrs. Jones, your cholesterol is 210. That's just fine. Or your cholesterol is 240. Well, it's a little high. They didn't even know HDL and LDL. In the 60s, they realized that cholesterol travels throughout the body in two basic packages, HDL and LDL. They're called lipoproteins. It's not actually cholesterol. Cholesterol can't float in the bloodstream. It has to be packaged and travel in something. Like you can't throw your luggage in the ocean, but you can put it in a trunk and then contain it on a ship, and it will be fine. That's what cholesterol is. It's the cargo, not the boat. And when they found out that there are two kinds of boats, they thought this is a red letter day, because HDL seems to do somewhat better things in general, and LDL seems to be involved in some bad stuff. So we're going to make good and bad cholesterol. That's 1963, folks. That's the equivalent of using not even a flip phone, one of those big phones that, like, those monster yes. And it's like, now we had flip phones, and then we had smartphones, and they're still using this thing, good and bad, which is tantamount to making health diagnoses if you could divide people into short and tall. Widely speaking, very tall people have certain issues that very short people don't have. Would you really want a diagnosis based on whether you're short and tall when we can decode the entire human genome at this point? So cholesterol counts, but what you need to know is there's not two kinds of cholesterol. There are 13. 13. Count them. There's I'm going to give you just a few. HDL 2A, 2B, 3A, LDL-A, LDL-B, LDL-3A, 3B, LP little a, oxidized cholesterol, ApoB. There are 13 different kinds of cholesterol, and they don't all behave the same. And when we measure it properly, we get some useful information. Like, for example, your particle number. How many boats are there in the water? What causes crashes is not what's in the cargo, how much cholesterol, it's how many boats are in the water. The more boats you have in the water, the more chances there are that there are going to be accidents. Like a stray LDL particle winding up in some inflamed part of the arteries and then starting a whole cascade that can lead to plaque. That's going to happen the more particles there are. But we're not measuring particles, and we should. Give you a personal example. I have had perfect HDL, LDL numbers for my entire life. Doctor would be thrilled with them. When I started getting the particle test, I find out I'm in the high danger range in terms of numbers of particles. And the size of those particles tend to be small, which we can now measure, and small ones are much more atherogenic and much more predictive in insulin resistance. So we have all this data, and now I'm working to lower my particles. And actually, even some of my functional medicine people said, maybe a statin. The point is, there are people like me who may be being underprescribed, if not statins, then some other treatment, because we don't even know that we're in danger because we're looking at the old-fashioned, stupid, short and tall, good and bad. Cholesterol is not good or bad. It's the same cholesterol. It travels in different containers, and we need to start looking at the data that we can actually take from these blood tests to find out what we should do to prevent heart disease. As I've said, every time I lecture, I said, we're great at lowering cholesterol, not so great at preventing heart disease.
Well, and that's the thing. The target was lower cholesterol, and that would equate to
it does not
heart disease. But that is not what study after study. They actually did a study. We put it in Cholesterol Clarity. You had it in your book too, about the hospital.
Yeah.
They did all these people, and half of them had cholesterol that was considered healthy, under
healthy
2.
and normal. Yep. And
those still had a heart attack. Those people still had chest pain, angina. They had all these things despite having the very best cholesterol there was. So at some point, Jonny, you and I will just be talking till we're blue in the face with this, but at some point, something's got to give and change has to happen. What do you think's going to do to make that happen?
I wish I could be optimistic and wonderfully Panglossian about it and say, oh, it's really changing. I actually, sadly, if I can be truthful with you, you're my long-term friend, I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime. I literally think that generation will have to die out and be replaced by more nutritionally aware, functional medicine aware, holistically trained doctors, and enough of them will eventually become the majority that you will see a real shift, and we will stop concentrating on this lab marker. You used a wonderful example earlier about treating numbers, and I always used to say, Western medicine looks at the symptoms, the numbers in the lab tests that are before them. Eastern medicine says, who is this patient? Who is this person who has the disease? Let's look at all those factors. We're not good at that. We're good at looking at lab values. And I'm all for measuring cholesterol the proper way, but I'm also for measuring all the other things you mentioned, which form a complete picture of your risks, and is just 100% more valuable than looking at an outdated test for a marker that's iffy in terms of its predictive value for anything.
Well, and even the 200 total cholesterol, let me unpack that for people that haven't heard this story before. So 200, it's the only health marker that I'm aware of, Jonny, that looks at the 50th percentile. In other words, half the population is above that number, the other half of the population is below that number, and the ones above are more at risk, the ones below are less at risk. That's kind of the general kind of concept of that 200. No other health marker looks at 50th percentile. They're always 75, 80, 85, not 50. And so it's an artificially lower number, and you and I both know why it's artificially lower. They want to get more people on this medication, statin medications, which thankfully they're now generic, so they don't make as much money off of them anymore. But I noticed the other day, Jonny, there is a brand new commercial. There's always a new drug. On TV that I was watching while I was watching the golf, and it was this new, when statins aren't enough,
Yes,
here's this new adjunct that you take with your statin. So still take your statin. Now we're going to bamboozle you. Convince you to take another drug on top of that. Like, the madness is so obvious at this point. I don't know how people still buy into it.
Well, it's a multi-layered problem, and there's a lot of things to unpack about it. But I think if I want to make sure that I talk to this audience, because you guys don't need the convincing that your doctors need about looking elsewhere beside an outdated test. So what I want our audience to know, what I want, is that when Dr. Sinatra and I revised this book, we went back to research going back to 1970. And we looked at stuff that was hiding in plain sight. Like what really did cholesterol? We know, you just mentioned one of the studies that showed that 50% of people who were admitted to hospitals for cardiovascular disease have normal cholesterol. There's actually a couple more that show it even higher, up to 70%. Their cholesterol is just fine. And I talk about it in the book, and there's the Leonhardt study, all these studies where cholesterol doesn't budge, but people get better, right? So we looked at what does predict heart disease. I mean, yes, these particle tests help. They're a good risk factor. But what could we see early on that would say, hey, this person's on the way to danger? And we found it. We didn't find it. We discovered that it had been researched for since 1970. And I'll tell you about the main study that attracted me, that started us looking here. And it fit into a hunch you and I have had for a long time. So what this doctor did, Dr. Kraft, Joseph Kraft, back in the 70s, he developed the insulin assay. Now, if you don't, an assay is a test. It's a lab test that tells you what's in something or how something performs. And he developed the world's best test, the only test at the time, for insulin resistance. And I know your audience is familiar with that. So I'm going to pass over what it is and just talk about the fact that it is. So he measured this, and it was a very cumbersome test. It took a lot of hours. They had to be in the office. I mean, people weren't going to just go in there and get a pinprick. They had to really sit. But the test was perfect. It was a really good test. So he takes his study population, and he divides them into 5 quintiles. People who have no insulin problem at all. They're totally insulin sensitive. They eat food, blood sugar goes up, insulin comes in, removes the sugar, sends it to the muscle cells, blood sugar normalizes, they eat again, perfect carbohydrate metabolism, not a problem. And then all the way up to completely insulin resistance. You eat a Brussels sprouts, your sugar goes up, insulin can't get rid of it. So the most resistant to the least resistant. And then he followed them for a decade or so. And he just wanted to know how many people got sick. So you know how many people in the totally insulin sensitive, that 20%? Zero. Zero in 10 years, defying every possible actuarial table you could come up with. This population, somebody had to get sick. No. In the most extreme quintile, that's where all the heart disease, that's where all the diabetes, that's where all the obesity, and it was in between. Now, here's where it gets even better. If you define insulin resistance, depends on how you define it. I suspect, excuse me. This is the other finding of that was even more interesting, is that about 10 years later, Gerald Reaven, who invented metabolic syndrome, or syndrome X, which we now call diabetes, he had discovered insulin resistance had a very definite causal effect on prediabetes, but on diabetes, on obesity, and heart disease. So out of curiosity, he kind of thinks, let me do the same thing Kraft did. I got all this data on insulin resistance. Let's see if it relates to anything else. Like, for example, cancer or liver disease or lung disease. Guess what? All of them. And you and I have talked about this, and this is one of the things that drives me nuts about the political atmosphere, is this is so related to COVID. We can't even talk about this relationship to COVID on YouTube. They will censor it right out. But think this through with me, audience. What are the main conditions that predispose you to a bad outcome if you catch COVID? And I think when it all pans out, we're going to find out that 50 to 80% of people have been exposed to it. They're asymptomatic, asymptomatic. But if you look at every one of those conditions, Jimmy, what are they? Prediabetes, high blood pressure, insulin resistance syndrome, diabetes, heart disease. We think diabetes, by the way, is pre-heart disease. That's what we think, and that's what we talk about in the book. And then there's these few others that I felt they were outliers. I mean, they're not really related, are they? I mean, lung disease, liver disease, kidney disease. So I spend a morning on PubMed looking at the literature. Every one of them has a statistically significant connection to insulin resistance. So here you've got this thing that shows up 10 years before people get sick, 10 years before your A1C goes up, 10 years before your glucose goes up, 10 years before your doctor says, Mr. Jones, your cholesterol is high. No, you got this warning sign 10 years ago, and it can be treated, reversed, or prevented with diet, no statins needed, and we're not even looking for it.
It's only a warning sign if there's a doctor or some other medical professional looking for it. And that's what you're calling for in your book, is for the doctors to start looking for it. But therein lies the problem again, Jonny. If they're stuck in the old 1960s model of the standard lipid panel and looking at LDL and total cholesterol, how do we fast forward them to 2020 retrospect science, looking at it since 1970 and the Kraft assays, which, by the way, Ivor Cummins did a wonderful job, guys. Go look up some videos he did, kind of going all nerdy, in his engineering brain just outlined it all. And Jonny, you put it in your book, but it's incredible information. How do we get it into the mainstream of medicine?
Well, there's a step we can take before that. We talk in the book about ways that you can measure insulin resistance at home, folks. We give them a low-tech way that costs nothing that you can do right now. I'll even tell you what it is. We talk of a modest way to do it. You only need one blood measurement from your doctor. It's pretty easy to get. It's under $100. You get your fasting insulin. I'll tell you how to compute it from that. And then, of course, there's the Tesla of tests. There's an actual LabCorp test for insulin resistance, and it's
IR.
Huh?
The HOMA IR?
Well, HOMA IR is the middle one that you can do at home if you just get your fasting insulin. The low-tech one is the one I'm going to tell you about now. But you really, if you can, and these tests are now offered by Quest and they're offered by LabCorp. They're not esoteric things you got to go, to overseas to get. You can get them to be ordered. So here's what people can do before you convince your doctor, because that's going to be a long time coming, if ever. If you buy into this, even a little, you can test your own insulin resistance, and that may give you some motivation to find a doctor who actually knows how important that is. So here's your low-tech way. You stand in front of a wall. Face the wall. Start walking towards the wall. If your waistline hits the wall before your nose, very likely, maybe 95% certain that there's insulin resistance. So if that's the case, that's the time to take a look at what would reduce insulin resistance. You don't have to wait for your conservative doctor to find this information. And I think if enough people do that, or they do, as you mentioned, the HOMA test, I tell them how to do that online. That's just one step harder than walking into the wall. You don't even have to wait. And I'll tell you something. I've even heard some really smart doctors like Peter Attia, who are a little bit more conservative on cholesterol than I might be, but who's really smart. And they are talking about just getting these conservative doctors to use a test called the ApoB test, because it's a great surrogate for the particle test, and every doctor knows what ApoB is. So you don't have to convince them there's all new. Just, dude, run this test, will you? Because ApoB attaches itself to every particle. So it's a very good surrogate for learning how many particles you have.
And ApoB is a proxy marker, you guys. What he's saying, a surrogate for LDLP, which would be on this test called NMR lipoprofile. So that's that particle that Jonny had a whole lot of particles, and a lot of he's trying to help eliminate some of the small, dense version of those. So,
and that's my personal case too. That's
right. So ApoB would be basically the same as the LDLP. They run in conjunction.
So yes, and it's a cheaper one, and the doctors know what it is, and it's already on the requisition list. So maybe we can do an interim step and just get them to measure that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many ways. And I wonder with those assays, by the way, that Kraft ran and some of the other ones that are out there, did they measure alongside the insulin? Did they measure any inflammatory markers? Because I would think the ones that are in the higher, heavier insulin resistant, they're going to naturally have higher inflammation. They have to. And then versus that, the more insulin sensitive ones have to have lower. So is it the insulin resistance? Is it the inflammation? Does it matter really at the end of the day? They run parallel.
That's my answer has always been that they always ask which came first, inflammation or oxidation? I mean, something like a rogue LDL particle gets into an inflamed little break in the endothelial wall. It lodges itself in a parking space where it doesn't belong. All of a sudden it gets inflamed, it gets oxidized. Which one comes first? I don't know. They happen together so often that it really almost doesn't matter whether the inflammation causes further oxidation or the oxidation starts the inflammatory cascade. They happen together. And I did want to mention something about that insulin resistance test. Again, from my experience. So you know, and many people know that I'm an ex-drug addict and alcoholic. I spent some time in the 80s in Alcoholics Anonymous, very helpful. And one thing I learned in there was a very interesting experience I had once. There was a 16-year-old kid in there. And in alcoholism, they talk about a high bottom, a low bottom. People have to hit their bottom. And sometimes bottom is jail or on the Bowery or being homeless. And sometimes they're a high functioning bottom. They've got a corporate job and they're just an alcoholic, but they keep it quiet and they function fairly well on the surface of things. So the 16-year-old kid seemed to be functioning pretty well. And 16 is kind of an early age to get yourself smart enough to know, I got a problem, I better do something about it. So this kid was speaking one day, and they asked him about that. Like, you've never been to jail, your life hasn't fallen apart, you haven't dropped out of school, what happened? And he says, alcoholism is like getting on a plane in New York that's going to LA. This plane is going to LA, nothing's going to stop it. You have the option of bailing out over Philadelphia. That's what I did, said the kid. I knew where this was going. I wanted to get off the train before it got there. That's what insulin resistance is. That's the train that's going to take you to prediabetes, diabetes, and sure as hell, in 80% of the cases, diabetics die of heart disease. This is a straight line, folks. So finding that is like that 16-year-old saying, whoa, I know where this train is going. I'm going to change my diet right now because I don't want to go to that destination.
Jonny, let's camp out in COVID for a second, because you mentioned all of the kind of comorbidities that are related to insulin resistance. And this is why I asked the inflammation question.
Yeah.
The inflammation is already higher in these patients who are getting infected with heavy viral load of COVID-19. That would explain why it's cascading through their body so quickly. They already had a fire going on in their body. Then you add gasoline to the fire with COVID-19 and they go down this disease path. And it's amazing to me that the first thing that the wizards on high from Dr. Fauci on down did not do was say, okay, guys, it's going to be inevitable. We'll probably all get this at some point. So we're not worried about infection rates. We want you to make the host as healthy as possible. And the way we do that is increase vitamin D and vitamin C, eat real food, lower your glycemic load, lower your inflammation. And here's how you do it. Why didn't that happen?
No, Jimmy, I love you so much. It's just hearing you. It's like I've made maybe 15 videos on YouTube that have said exactly what you just said right now. We have no control over a virus any more than we have control over a hurricane. If we have a home on the coast of Florida and a hurricane's coming, you can't do a damn thing about the hurricane, but you can do something about the house.
Right.
You can do something about the foundation. When that hurricane is done, several houses are going to be wiped out and others are going to be standing. And it's not an accident. And I'm not blaming the victim here. I'm saying those that are less well constructed are most likely to succumb to a challenge, whether it's a hurricane or a virus. So the action is in us fortifying the house, the host, us. And we do that with a million things that you just mentioned, that I've mentioned on YouTube. And that's where the action is, because that's all we can do. We can't go out there and these, you're absolutely right, case counts mean nothing. We want to know deaths. We want to know bad reactions. And the data that I've looked at has shown that every time they track vitamin D levels with bad COVID outcomes, I'm talking either dying or like being a long hauler or just a very serious, they track those two things together, and the deficiency rate on vitamin D is something like between 98 and 100%. So that's one thing we could do. Also not allowed to be discussed on YouTube. Think about that. You can discuss it. It's very discouraged, and they have lots of economic ways of discouraging you from putting that up. As
It's misinformation. Let's get into that a little bit. Because the censorship, like you and I have been in the alternative space a very long time, you much longer than me, but both of us a long time. Did you ever imagine there would come a time when they would like like overtly try to silence the voices of people like us. Like, we knew they were kind of not happy with some of the things we said, and maybe they implemented things behind the scenes, shadow banning and those kinds of things, blocking your video from being able to be seen and all this. 2020, the gloves are off. Like, Zuckerberg and YouTube CEO and all these guys, they're just like, look, we're going to stop misinformation. And my first question is, who gets to decide what's
Well, that's
misinformation?
the problem. I understand they mean well, but they're not experts in every one of these topics and every one of these subjects. So who is going to make the decision? They are going to look to the absolute narrowest establishment view of what is officially endorsed. And if it deviates from that, that's going to be considered disinformation. I have lived with this all my life as a writer. When I write for popular magazines, they have fact checkers. The fact checkers tend to be 12 years old, right out of journalism school. They don't know the subject they're fact checking, because one day it might be an article on sailboats and another day it might be an article on healthy fats. So what do? They go to the experts, and their Rolodex of experts is exclusively the establishment people. I have seen the New York Times write about vitamin D and leave out Michael Hollick. They don't even interview the pioneers in this field who are not absolute, down the line, mainstream. And so this has always been a problem. Who's going to do the fact checking? I did a video on this, and I'll just say the summary of it. You and I have colleagues called Green Med Info. They are very, very activist, and in my opinion, too far left wing on the COVID thing. That's not the point. They took their site down. They took their Instagram, or I'm not sure what it was.
They're off Instagram, right?
Right. So I did a protest, and again, not because I agree with them. The danger of censoring information, even when it is horrible information, and I'm not saying theirs is horrible. I'm saying it's very much stronger than my position. I don't agree with it. But I grew up in a Jewish home in New York City among liberal progressive people with a lawyer for a father, old country lawyer in the best sense of the word, wanting justice. And we believed in the American Civil Liberties Union. The time that I was growing up, the American Nazi Party was marching through neighborhoods. And the ACLU and my father said, you have got to defend their right. Because if you only defend the right of people who agree with you, you are not defending free speech, and they're going to come for them now, and they're going to come for you next when they don't like what you say. So I said on YouTube, I don't care how horrible this information is. You are better off hearing a free and open exchange of ideas, and then the onus is on you, the consumer, to decide what's bullshit and what's not. I'm sorry, we can't do that for you. But the answer is not to have a 12-year-old with no expertise in any of these fields deciding what's official information. That is a dangerous situation, Jimmy.
And that's been the frustration. It's almost as if they're setting up the boogeyman as information is harmful. No, information is informative, so that then, okay, you have this side. I'll go to the hydroxychloroquine, zinc,
Sure.
and zip.
Sure.
That group of doctors that got so blacklisted, they made that Sella Emanuel doctor look like a fool. Meanwhile, 2 weeks later, the Texas medical board went, oh, she was fine. Like, they reported her to the board. They cleared her of all charges, but it was swept under the rug. The damage was done trying to make fun of her. And they're silencing those voices when we now know, as a prophylactic and in the early days of COVID, if you do that protocol, people get better 98% of the time. And so it's like, information is not harming. Information is informing so that people can make the best choice. If you only hear one side, you are being propagandized.
Yes, it's a very sad situation, and it parallels a lot of things that are going on in society. But I've often said that if you shut down Green Med Info or any of the other sites on any side of, no matter how extreme, the next thing you're going to do is shut me down from saying that cholesterol isn't the main source of heart disease, and that maybe we shouldn't all be on statins, and that's going to be considered just as inflammatory and just as much disinformation. And Jimmy, you know this. They have done this. The establishment has done this. I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but every one of us that has written a book or an article or taken a public position that is highly different, very, very distinctly different from the establishment, the playbook is identical. First, they go after our credentials. Then they go after, our reliability. Then they go after our conflicts of interest. Oh, wait, he once sold a vitamin. Clearly, he's got a conflict of interest. So that's the standard playbook, is to discredit. I know that everybody prefers simple, easily digested information, yeses and nos and memes and things, but there's no way we can we have to be our own intelligent consumer of information. The answer is not to prevent that information from getting to us because there's a lot of garbage in it. The answer is for us to be better at filtering what makes sense and what doesn't.
And a bunch of us, you and me included, Malcolm Kendrick, I'm trying to remember who all was in the list, but a bunch of us were removed from Wikipedia last year. All of our Wikipedia pages got totally taken down because we were cholesterol deniers. And there was somebody at Wikipedia in the editorial board that just had a vendetta against all of us that were talking about cholesterol being healthy and good and da-da-da. I don't know if you knew that or not, but surprise.
I did not.
That you got censored. But last year, it was about March or April, Google changed their algorithm so you couldn't find things anymore. And Joe Mercola, one of the biggest sites in the world for health, he had 90% of his traffic just disappear overnight.
It's very upsetting. It's very upsetting. I don't want to depress the audience. I want you to feel empowered, because this may all be going on socially. This may be the whole morass that's social media. But you as an individual, you, Jimmy, Jonny, the people who are listening to this, you still have the power to make some executive decisions about your own health. You and I have both independently come up with the phrase, which we both use. I always smile when I hear you use it, because I used it and we didn't take it from each other. We both came up with it, which is the leader of your own healthcare team. That's what we want our audiences to be. There's no way to abdicate those responsibilities. So yeah, it's harder work to figure it out. But what I always tell people, I'm sure they say this to you, how come nutritionists change their mind every week? How come this information it's as if they expect that scientists all have a convention once a year. They go up to the top of the mountain, they decide what the truth is, they come back and tell us. It's not how it works, obviously. But what I always remind people of is they get very frustrated with that. And I'm sure the people who talk to you get frustrated with the change in nutrition. One day butter's good, one day coffee's good, then it's not. What I always point out to them, in their daily lives, they deal with this every day. We watched a debate last night. People have to decide who made more sense. We have a dental procedure we need, and one guy said, you need a root canal, and you get a second opinion and say, I think I can do it without the root canal. I can do it this way. You have difficult choices to make. I had two friends who had cancer this year. I don't even want to tell you the odds they had to calculate. And well, if you do this, the odds are this. But if you have this other precondition, the odds are that. You have to be a mathematical genius just to compute what treatment you do. And people do it. They pick the right school for their kid with conflicting information. They pick the right sport. They do it every day. We are much smarter at that than we think. But somehow when it comes to nutrition and medicine, we think it should all be done for us. We don't have to make decisions. We don't have to decide if somebody's a quack or if somebody's making a lot of sense, if somebody's being censored or if somebody's promoting an agenda. We don't have to decide that. We want to not have to decide that, but we have to. We've got to listen to people and actually make our own judgments, just like we are capable of doing everywhere else in our lives.
Well, and medical stuff and health things, nutrition, people are like, well, I don't have enough personal knowledge to make those decisions for myself. And I'm like, there are so many podcasters. There are so many, even doctors now doing YouTube videos. Like, if you're not educating yourself, that's on you. If you're just relying on your medical doctor as your sole source of information about all things health, you are missing out on a great abundance. Now, obviously, they're watching me, listening to my show, and engaging in my work. So they are, if you're listening right now, unless you're a brand new listener, hello if you're new, but most of you are old timers and you've kind of followed my work for years. You've known about Jonny's work. This is something that you're passionate about, but getting more people to get away from the system and into you are your own best health advocate is kind of the key here, and getting them to let go of those I don't have enough knowledge to make a good decision thoughts.
It's exactly right. We don't have enough knowledge. I've always felt I don't know if you feel this way. I have a feeling you may. I've always felt that my greatest strength in terms of the audience is not that I have all the answers, because God knows I don't. I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I don't do original research like some of these. I'm not running labs and doing phase 4 clinical interventions. I'm very good at explaining this stuff to people. And I've always felt that one of my gifts, if I have any gifts, is to direct people to the right people to listen to. I don't have all the answers, but if you ask me about autoimmune disease, I'm not going to send you to some quack on the internet who's got some
Right.
cockamamie theory about drinking celery juice. I'm going to send you to Isabella Wentz, or I'm going to send you to Mary Showman. And because I know who you should be listening to, even if you want different points of view about things, even if you want, I want to hear what the other side says. What is the side who believes in statin drugs and thinks that, what's their argument? Does it make sense? Let me hear the other people. So I always felt that what we do in a way is we're good Sherpas. We have great information, but we're also very generous. I know you are, about steering people to other people who are equal. And then what audiences do is you find your gurus, you find this guy, he said such great things about these subjects I know something about. Let me see what he says about that. After a while, you hear the tone, you get them, and you decide who you want to go check out. And you have your little group of that. And you've certainly done that by sending people to me, and I've certainly told people about you. And I think that that's the thing, because just listening to information can also make you nuts. There's a lot of crazy, absolutely batshit nutty crazy information about health and nutrition on the internet. So part of being a better consumer is also knowing what sources to pay attention to and how to kind of negate the stuff that's just complete bogus.
When I started in this space 15 plus years ago, Jonny, I did not intend on being a curator and be a go-between, but that's just what I grew into.
It's a great thing to be.
And formed those relationships with all kinds of people. And now today, my passion is the people that listen to me, the people that watch me. I do 5 live shows a week. I do 3 podcasts a week. I'm always writing content. It's like content. Of course, you're a writer, and that's a great way to get the word out there. How many books have you written now?
I've written 15, and plus the Metabolic Factor, which is online only, and that's the weight loss and metabolism program. That actually is the best-selling thing I ever wrote in my life. But so 16 if you include Metabolic Factor. 15 traditionally published in the bookstore type books.
And when was your first book? When was it published?
My first book came out the day after 9/11. So it did get a lot of attention. And of course, that wasn't planned. That was the pub date. And my first book was called Jonny Bowden's Shape Up, the 8-week program to transform your body, your health, and your life. No one read it but my mother and my girlfriend, because it came out on 9/12. But, it was in the window of Barnes & Noble. I took a picture. I was happy to.
Oh, yeah, dude. Like, I have 9 books now. I'm catching up to you, dude. But like you had this nice little series of 150
yeah.
blah, blah, blah on Earth. So it was really cool. If you guys have never looked at Jonny Bowden's library, go check him out. But definitely the re-release of The Great Cholesterol Myth was one of my favorite books you've done, other than Living the Low Carb Life, which is now called Living Low Carb. Go look that up, you guys. You did update that one recently as well.
January 4th edition, and you're in it.
Yeah, thank you. And so carnivore is in there. You added some newer things that have recent years, and it does this comparison of all the kind of lower carb approaches and what the benefits are, the not so great benefit, and all this kind of stuff. So you are definitely well written, well read. It's why you and I get along. I think writers and talkers love talking to other writers.
Writing and talking, man. That's the only 2 skills I've got, but they've served me well, and they're certainly 2 of your wonderful skills. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you have a PhD in nutrition. Is that what the doctor is?
Yeah, I have a master's in psychology and a PhD in holistic nutrition, and I'm board certified. So I have postdocs.
I've been offered, Jonny, over the years, and I'd love to get your take on this. I have resisted getting letters after my name. I think there's something really powerful about being empowered patient Jimmy Moore rather than Jimmy Moore FNTP, Jimmy Moore RD, Jimmy Moore.
I 100% agree with you. And in fact, I have tried, and some of my best friends in the business, like Dr. Jade Teta, have tried for years to just dump the doctor, and he wants to be just Jade Teta. And I constantly put out stuff with just Jonny Bowden. This is what I stand for. I've been around a while. I'm going to be 74 next year. I think I've earned, you don't need my letters. Either evaluate my information. It's either true or it's not. And yet, because I've done so many things as Dr. Jonny Bowden, so I agree with you. I probably wouldn't do it. It's nice to have it and not use it. That's the power move, right? You have it, but you don't even mention it.
Well, if you combine the ones that I've been on other people's shows, which I've been on many of your shows, including a radio show.
Oh my God.
And my own shows, I've done 5,000 interviews in my career in the past years. And so I kind of feel like I have honorary PhDs at this point.
We've learned most. I'm not poo-pooing the education of a doctor or a naturopath or a DO or any of these people who spend years in internships and residencies. I mean, it's very valuable. It's very important. But there's also something to be said for self-learning and for even for the people who have that medical background. They also go. I see them at the nutritional conferences. The same 300 doctors. There's 800,000 of them in the country. The same 300 show up at the nutritional stuff. Most of them don't. But there's a great deal to be said from that kind of thing. And there's so much information that's out. You mentioned it, that are like medical lectures. I mean, you can see stuff from Stanford that's on YouTube now. And so I still am enough of a traditionalist to believe that some kind of conventional and traditional education, for example, when I was in grad school in psychology, I was required to take statistics. Now, I don't know if you get this picture, but growing up, I was a musician, changed my career to psychology, like in the I had no more interest in math or statistics than you probably have in Portuguese water dogs. I mean, it was a completely, I did not care and statistics turned out to be the most valuable class I ever took in my life. It showed me how research is done. It lets me read research. It let me see through bullshit research. And it lets me see through advertising and the use of relative numbers and all the tricks that they use. And it turned out to actually be really one of the most important pieces of my education, which I would never have gotten were it not required. So I do believe there are things that you get in a standard education that you might not have taken otherwise, and that they do inform you and help you. I'm not putting that down, but I do also think that we have to have more honor for our clinical experience, our life experience, the podcasts we listen to, the lectures we go to on our own. I mean, think of the movie Good Will Hunting, this mathematical genius who dropped out of high school. I mean, there is that too, and we can't dismiss the people like Ivor who didn't go to medical school, but damn, I'm taking his information over a lot of other people who did go to medical school.
Jonny, I'm in awe of you right now because you are older than both of my mom and my dad.
Yes, you mentioned that several times.
My mom is, I think they're both 70 years old exactly. And my dad is super frail. Of course, he had 2 heart attacks at 48 and 50 and quintuple heart bypass at 54. He went through trauma in his life. So he's got some stuff on his body.
Sure.
My mom has myasthenia gravis and some other health issues. She's doing better. I got her on keto now, so she's out of pain from some of that. But like, dude, you are like so vibrant. Like I could see you at 90. Yeah, listen, I've been saying this for years. And out there.
It doesn't sound like that, but okay, thank you.
I'm going to be right there with you. No, that Casey Kasem voice is never going away.
Let me finish with that since you brought it up. I mean, one of the reasons I am really so passionate about this at this stage of my life, because I'm 74. I'll be 74 next month. And I see those people who are 10 years younger than me that can barely get through the day. I see them, some of the guys I play tennis with who are in my age group. I also play tennis with 14-year-olds, by the way, and can keep up. So, I mean, I'm just saying, I see what you're talking about. And it is all the more important to me to get people when they're 25, 35, 45, 55 and say, it does not have to end that way. I mean, I was a drug addict. I was shooting heroin. I was snorting cocaine. I was a mess up to 38. All right. I started to put it together around 38. If I could do that and I can live life the way I live with such It's not put on. I am enthusiastic about life. I am excited about life. I wake up every day. I'm never like, oh God, I'm tired. I gotta. No, it's like, what would you do next? And I know that that is a function of eating well, having the lifestyle you and I talked about, having relationships like you and I have, having making a contribution, having pets that I spend time with, being outside, getting vitamin D, taking walks. I know that a few small things like that, not lowering your damn cholesterol, but doing those things can change your life. And in this COVID time, if you do this, what we talk about in the book, if you start eating a diet that will reverse your insulin resistance, you are going to be protecting yourself against the worst things, the worst outcomes that happen if you catch COVID. I've said many times that I'm not afraid of COVID, and I don't say it as a COVID denier. I am not a COVID denier. That is a nasty virus. It's different than other viruses. It inhabits the body in a different way. It causes different damages. It's scary. The reason I'm not afraid of it, the reason I'm not cowering, I'm not wearing a mask in the middle of a field, I'm not being absolutely terrified, is because I'm pretty sure this house is pretty well constructed. And as my friend Daniel Amen said when I interviewed him, I think I told you this offline, but I interviewed the great Dr. Daniel Amen for my podcast, my series, and I said, Daniel, yeah, I know you have a new book coming up, but it's crazy not to ask you. We're doing this in the middle of this pandemic. You and I are in the same age group. He's younger than me, but I said, are you scared? And this is exactly what he said. He said, well, it's a nasty virus, and I certainly don't want to get it. But my vitamin D levels are 73. I think I'll be okay. And you know, again, I'm not saying vitamin D is magic. I'm saying there are things that we can do to make this house ready for action. And that's what I want people to understand, that this diet that we've been eating, this low-fat, high-carb diet, has also set us up for bad outcomes with COVID. Not just heart disease and all the other stuff that goes with it, but bad outcomes for COVID as well. It is time to change that diet.
Although we do have great research that shows vitamin D is pretty magical for this virus. And so
Right.
all the things like vitamin D, when this thing first went down, Jonny, the very first thing I did, I already took about 10,000 IU a day. I bumped it up to 25 to 30.
A day? That's a lot.
Well, I tend, for some reason, I don't absorb it as well as
Yeah,
others.
I was going to say that some people have shitty receptors. They don't, you know, they're taking a lot. You gotta do the blood test, folks. You can't guess at this.
No. So when I would test, it'd be in the 40s. I'm like, no, I want it to be up in the 60s,
God,
70s,
I
and
understand.
the 10,000 a day. So then I bumped it up 25 to 30. Then during the summer months, which we're just coming out of, I backed it down to 10 again, and then just stood out naked in my backyard and let all the sun hit my
Good.
body minutes a day.
Good for you.
Produced it that way. And now I'm starting to bump it back up again now that the sun's going down sooner. So yeah, I mean, doing all the things, you can really put your body in a good position. So thank you for mentioning those things. Again, you guys, Jonny Bowden, JonnyBowden over on Instagram. And you can check him out there. He does have a link tree to all of the things that are going on in his life, including his brand new edition of his book, The Great Cholesterol Myth. Go get it right now. I think you had it on your one of your things there. Let's see. Yep, there it is. So there's the picture for those of you watching on YouTube.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so thank you so much for being here today. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure. I love you so much, and I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you for all your help.